The Singapore Premier League kicked off on May 10th, 2024, and by the time the competition concludes, the Earth will have completed an entire orbit around the Sun and then some. It is the longest planned season in soccer history. In a sport where leagues date all the way back until 1888, no one has tried to do what is happening in the Lion City right now. Sure, the Danish Superliga also covered 12 months, but that was due to a global pandemic no one could have possibly planned for. And this was something not limited to Denmark. Asia had a few different soccer leagues that took over a year to complete because of the pandemic. The Oman Professional League, Saudi Pro League, Persian Gulf Pro League, Qatar Stars League, Thai League 1, and the Hong Kong Premier League all went more than a full calendar year, but all were also disrupted by the pandemic. Those running the Singapore Premier League believe this 12-month campaign is a good idea. You could say this is the soccer league that... Alright, so originally that was a clip of that really stupid Lamb Chop song, but I just couldn't bring myself to do that to you or anyone. And if you don't know what song I am talking about, be grateful. Don't go searching for it. You have been warned. Back to the topic at hand, how does such a ridiculous thing happen? A 12-month slog of a football season never before seen. Well, the never-ending Singapore Premier League season of 2024 is a byproduct of quite a few forces outside of its control, as well as some good old-fashioned confusing Southeast Asian football decisions, and perhaps not necessarily thinking things through all the way. Prior to 2023, Singapore's domestic soccer league would start sometime in February, March, or even April, run anywhere from 7 to 9 months, and then they just call it a day. Fairly typical format and scheduling that ensured teams could avoid having to play games during the country's northeast monsoon season. This schedule also ran parallel to the Asian Champions League and other AFC continental competitions. It was also the schedule format that most countries in Asia went by. Then in early 2022, the Asian Football Confederation decided they were switching the calendar to match the European one, even though many member countries don't follow that. Among the reasons given is that it would make it easier for Asian teams to sign overseas players and coaches. Of course, that completely ignores the Chinese Super League. Yes, the CSL, which signed like a gazillion overseas players and coaches during the early 2010s, but did not play on the European calendar. Playing from February, March, April to November or whatever, it didn't ever hinder those efforts. In reality, this was all about kowtowing to FIFA, who are desperate to make their Club World Cup a thing, despite the fact literally no one wants it. Not fans, not players, not coaches, and not the clubs themselves by and large. Oh yeah, FIFA also keeps moving the World Cup to the Northern Hemisphere winter, making that European calendar less and less relevant because they're just going to disrupt it anyway. Straight up, the single-year season that most countries in Asia follow lines up better with the 2034 World Cup in Saudi Arabia because you're not breaking up domestic leagues. Don't let a little thing like logic get in the way of your blatant cash grabs, eh? Anyway, the AFC calendar switch decision placed many domestic leagues in Asia in a bind. Now the middle part of continental competitions is being played during a time when the domestic season is finished or close to it, and the final stages are in the early throes of league play. Suboptimal. Oh, and by the way, since we're on the topic of dumb things being done by the AFC, it certainly feels like their branding, their marketing is now being carried out by some 15-year-old. This year saw the Asian Champions League rebranded to Asian Champions League Elite, while the AFC Cup is now known as the Asian Champions League 2, even though only a small number of teams in that Champions League are actually champions. You just can't make this stuff up, folks. Anyway, Asian soccer leagues have been slowly trying to figure out what the hell do they do next in regard to the calendar. Some have begun to transition. Japan will start their move to the split-year calendar starting next season. The Malaysian Super League switched over this year, and their 11-month campaign is certainly eye-watering. But their island neighbor to the south are taking the cake. The Singapore Premier League began play on May 10th, 2024, and the league will wrap up on May 25th, 2025, a full 12 months and some change. Here's the deal. I'm not going to fault the FAS for switching their calendar. It needed to be done, and there was never going to be a good time to do it. But they certainly did themselves no favors here. There are quite a few curious decisions that have made matters worse. For starters, the 2023 season ended in September, which is unusually early for the league, who also had to fit in the traditional end-of-season Singapore Cup. That, by the way, totally derailed by 2026 Asia World Cup qualifiers that happened in October and November. Singapore Cup games were happening like one a month for that span, and then they just rushed through the semifinals and finals in December. This created a massive 8-month gap between the last game of the 2023 SPL season, not that SPL, mind you, and the first game of what would be the 2024-2025 campaign. Now, there is a caveat here. As we mentioned, there were Singapore Cup games happening during the latter stages of 2024, so it wasn't an 8-month gap for domestic soccer. Another change ahead of the first split year Singapore Premier League season was the fact that teams would now play each other 4 times instead of 3 times. This, of course, adds more games and is only going to elongate the season. 2024 also an AFF Cup year. The ASEAN Championships took place in December. Under the previous calendar, this isn't a disruption. Under the new format, well, it runs smack dab right in the middle of the domestic season. And of course, every Southeast Asian team needs an unnecessarily long training camp for a competition that in the scheme of things means next to nothing because FIFA barely recognizes the AFF Cup. That's because it's played outside of the official FIFA-sanctioned international window. So yeah, winning the competition for your country, you'll almost see 0 boost in the FIFA rankings for it. Making matters worse, the organization of the AFF Cup has always been dubious over the years. There's always black eyes. There's always things you're just like, how the heck did this happen? Take, for instance, in 2024. When AFF Cup organizers didn't bother to check all of the medals, handing one that said runner-up to a Vietnamese player after his side had, in fact, won the tournament. The impact this had on the Singapore Premier League is that for basically 2 months, there would be 0 games played. From mid-November to mid-January, the domestic league just went on hiatus. That is on top of the 3-week break taken in late May and early June for Singapore's World Cup qualifiers. The Singapore Premier League season starts with 3 match days, then goes on a 3-week hiatus, basically so the national team can take 2 weeks to prepare for 2 games over a 5-day span. What was the result of all of that extra training? A 7-0 loss at home to South Korea and a 3-1 away loss to Thailand. Time well spent indeed. Just to cram as much change as possible into a single season, the FAS decided now the Singapore Cup was going to be played during the domestic league instead of having it after the league ends. A fair change for sure, no problems there, but because midweek games in a city-state are rare, this means the competitions interchange weeks during February and March. These are the decisions that see a 32-game slate now take an entire year and 2 weeks to complete. As I said before, transitioning the calendar was something the FAS needed to do. The execution, though, has created an absolutely preposterous scenario that was really avoidable. Quite frankly, there was no real need for the Singapore Premier League to go from 24 to 32 games this season in this go-round. Knowing you have World Cup qualifiers and the AFF Cup, that could have been delayed by a year. Or, let's just try this one on for size. Stop taking extraordinarily long and completely unnecessary national team breaks that don't see the national team perform any better. This is not exclusively a Singapore issue, by the way. Many countries in Southeast Asia do this, and the results are almost never beneficial. All you do is disrupt the domestic soccer league. That aside, let's put the Singapore Premier League in some context. How does it compare to the other longest soccer seasons? Well, the longest season in England was the 1946-47 campaign, which was completed in 289 odd days. That season was disrupted by a really bad winter that saw a lot of games needing to be postponed, as well as the fact that the British government refused to allow matches to happen during the midweek because they didn't want workers watching the footy. Of course, England rebuilding after the war, they want everyone working in factories, and night games still aren't much of a thing in the 1940s. It must also be noted that the 2019-2020 Danish Superliga spanned from July 12th, 2019 to July 29th, 2020. Denmark, of course, did not have a monopoly on soccer leagues running over 12 months during the pandemic. There were a handful in Asia that are worth mentioning as well. But also worth mentioning here is the reality none of these were planned. None of these were supposed to last more than 12 months. They just happened to. Beyond that, you have players like Julian Alvarez and Erling Haaland who will have played nearly a full year, but that is composed of work with both club and national teams. So they're playing a full calendar year, but it's not in the same league with the same team. The next Singapore Premier League season will run from August 2025 to May 2026, a fairly reasonable, normal schedule, all things considered. This campaign will be an odd one-off consigned to the history books and the odd pub quiz. What was the longest planned season in soccer history? That would be the 2024-2025 Singapore Premier League, a season that never ends, or at least it felt that way. And hey, at least those down in the Lion City now get to join all of the other leagues disrupted by the 2034 World Cup. Thanks, FIFA. And thank you for watching this video. If you would like to know more about Spain's ultimate yo-yo club, check out the video in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. And for the story of Laurent Robert, soccer's last existentialist, video lower left-hand corner of your screen. Until next time, I am Shine Hollis. This is The Touchback, and as always, hashtag take it out to the 25.